Just a moment. Okay, great. All right, so I have a summary of this week's reading to share. So, just so that we're all on the same page, I'll be covering pages in this text, this beautiful blue book, 121 to 141, or if you have paragraph numbers, that's chapter 4, paragraphs 14 to 29. So, in this section, Steiner begins by stressing that he's about to give us uh, these names that he's attributed to the planetary epochs that correspond with what we might be familiar with as the names of the celestial bodies in our solar system. But he says from the outset that he wants us to bracket the associations we might have with those, and that the relevant associations will eventually become clear later on. And he also acknowledges, and I thought this was really interesting the first time I read this because otherwise it would seem sort of absurdly simplified. But one thing he notes is that this is just a sketch, and that he says, this is a quote, the beings and destinies are no less manifold throughout these prior planetary epochs as we experience the manifold of beings and destinies on Earth. So I appreciated that from the outset as well. Um, and he also mentions from the outset, so these are like methodological items that and he said such things like this before, that what especially with Saturn, the Saturn and Sun epochs, which are much less like what we experienced during what he calls the Earth epoch than the Moon, there's not yeah, it's hard to imagine. And so that he'll be drawing analogies between what we experience today, eh, as in things like light and warmth, but these will actually be more of the like pre-phenomenal inner realities that actually have a genetic relationship with these phenomena that we experience on Earth. And then as I was reading this, I was continuously reminded of Barfield's aphorism in his novel An Ancestral Voice, which is a kind of like anthroposophical novel, but this aphorism, interior is anterior. And I just feel like it's just a helpful aphorism that kind of encompasses what Steiner, is giving here. And I was also reminded of what Max said last time, as insofar as like the history, cosmic history is sort of like spread out around us and within us, and we're just sort of and have amnesia to it. And what Steiner, at least as Steiner understands what he's doing, is providing us like the conceptual tools to be able to recognize it. And so he also, so for example, uh, what's immanent in us that is connected with these prior epochs, he says, is the corpse, the sleeping human, and the dreaming human. And we'd also say, like in Steiner's vision, Matt uses this phrase environmentality. So it's not just within us, but it's also distributed without as well. So he describes this rhythmic process of evolution, whereby with the Saturn phase, there's this achievement of the physical body up to a certain point that then readies it for the entrance of a higher member in the next incarnation. And then there's a cosmic sleep or death, and then an awakening for and a recapitulation of the former development up to that point of achievement, and then so on and so forth. And that the early members become increasingly perfected, and also are transformed by the addition of the higher members. And so he says, for example, the ego, which is like this member that the Earth epoch, as he describes it, is revolves around, that the ego's the role of the ego is to transform the other members until these become a reflection, a revelation of itself. And I think this is a kind of uh theme, I guess, throughout the whole process that he describes, this process of an activity producing a reflection that uh that then transmits a revelation of itself, and then it's just kind of ongoing cycling from there of creation. But also I was unsure at this moment when he says this of the ego, if this is always the case, at least for these members. Like, is it always the case that, for example, the etheric body, um, transform the physical body to receive a revelation of itself? I'm not sure about that. And then he has a little interesting aside that it's usually, and this is to illustrate like the perfection of the earlier members over the newer editions, that it's usually the astral body, which is a later edition, at least for humans, that causes illness, transmits it to some kind of disturbance in the astral body. The desiring body uh, transmits that to the etheric, and then the physical body. So yeah, just illustrating that he describes the sort of wisdom of the physical body is usually disrupted by the younger, wily astral body. So now on to the more like play-by-play of Saturn evolution. So he says like the only aspect of what we experience today in this Earth epoch that was present at that time was the physical human body, and also these super sensible beings in the periphery that were responsible for evolving it. And he also, interestingly, he begins in the middle of Saturn evolution. Why is an interesting question to ask. Well, partially, probably that's partially because um, at that point, according to him, there's a development that is, I guess, easier for us to grasp from the outset, in its being analogous to what we experience as warmth. But he says if there were a hypothetical observer, what they would experience approaching the Saturn being is this kind of differentiated mass, which is also not the correct word, of like inner warmth, like what we experience when we say, I feel warm, that kind of inner experience. That's what he says um, would register, and it's a differentiated mass of alternating temperatures from which irregular figures would be arising from the differences of warmth. So there's like this kind of activity where there's like some kind of form emerging and then dissolving. And then he goes on to kind of, elaborate his view of warmth as a finer substance. It's what gas is. Gas, for example, he says is condensed warmth, and it's a soul perception, so it's an inner reality. And that like the temperature oscillation, what we measure, I guess, in physics, according to Steiner, is the effects of these inner realities um, in the physical world. So again, interior is anterior. And then he makes this distinction between the physical and mineral bodies. So like he says today during the Earth epoch, our physical bodies are filled with mineral content. And so what the physical body actually is, he says, uh, is a body that is animated by physical laws that express themselves solely in warmth effects. So it's a delicate, tenuous, ethereal body of warmth. So we're in the middle of Saturn evolution, and you kind of imagine, like, at least as I imagine it from his telling, there's Saturn, which is this kind of like center with the periphery of spiritual beings, in continual interaction with the warmth bodies that constitute Saturn. And he says that, so like when he's starting out, he talks about the spirits of wisdom who are responsible for having shaped what the initial outpouring of will forces from the spirits of will, the spirits of wisdom have have combined with the activity of the spirits of will to produce these bodies, these kind of coherent bodies that reflect back to them, the spirits of wisdom, their own activity. And so these bodies are kind of like organ of their own self-perception. And so, yes, he says the beginning of Saturn is this outpouring of spirits of will who have just attained to this higher point of evolution. So they're like giving forth of themselves. And the spirits of movement come in, and a more kind of concerted activity starts to something that resembles more of like a whole organism, he says, of an in-soul drama of antipathy and sympathy, but he's like, it's just a reflection, it's not actually an organism yet. And then the spirits of form enter, and they like individuate the whole and turn it more into what he describes as like something that would appear like a blackberry or a mulberry, just appears like a conglomerate of soul beings, so it's not actually a conglomerate of soul beings. And then the spirits of personality intervene. And these beings, he says, their lowest body is an astral body, and they're kind of at different levels. And he says through them, the spirits of personality have this equivalent of an eye through their astral development. Through them, the eye looks down from its nature to the single live beings that like blueberry or Blackberry. Hence, something is sent forth from Saturn into the heavenly spaces that resembles the impression made by human personality in our present life. So, like this whole like environment, of like beings in the periphery and the center constitutes like this resemblance of what we experience as human personality in our lifetime from this kind of addition of that I in the periphery. And he says that, and this is so interesting. I think this is an interesting question maybe to consider today. That he says the spirits of personality or the archai were in their human epoch. And so basically, at least from what I gather from this description, to be human is to have an ego and to have some kind of device for reflecting it back to you so that you become conscious of it. But it doesn't necessarily mean you look like we do today. So that's interesting. And then the new phase begins where there's something like an inner life begins to flicker from all this activity, and it eventually begins to emit light. And then the fire spirits come in, and he says, like, for them, the like the light activity that's emerging from the warmth bodies on Saturn is a kind of organ for them of picture consciousness, which is equivalent to today's dreaming, he says. And that he also says these light archetypes are the seeds of our present physical sense organs. And then the spirits of love enter, and he says they make of us the seeds of sense organs for witnessing the cosmic processes. I'm like, okay. And that they provide the vessel, they like sacrifice themselves to be like the vessel for the fire spirit's perception. So it's so, I mean, this kind of reminds me of like Lynn Margulies, or just like the way that, the microscopic world is described, microbiomes and such like. Then he starts talking about like the inner equivalent of taste emerges, and this kind of reminded me of Jakob Burma and the way that he talks about the unfolding of the sort of like ontogenesis of reality in connection with different like bitter, sweet, sour. Then the angels come in, and their activity brings about something like metabolism, nutrition, and excretion indirectly, he says. Then he brings in the spirits of harmony, or the cherubim, and this sort of like context of interiority provides the context for their leadership. And so he says they transmit dreamless sleep consciousness to the angels like plants, and regulating life processes into a harmony with the outer world. So there we have like the dreamless sleep. Steiner, then he begins referring to sort of this like development of the bodies as phantoms of man or of the human. But he says, he's like reiterates, they're just semblances. They're not actually, they're vessels for this sort of activity from the periphery. And that they begin in a state of flux. They're gradually taking on more coherent form. And through the spirits of will, they have the darkest form of consciousness that minerals today possess. So I would assume that's like the corpse that he mentions from the outset. And then this is really interesting, also to consider, I think. He says the formation reflects the spirits of will who aim to regulate, quote, the inner nature of the object or being into unison with the physical external world, end quote, such that the shape of the phantom bodies becomes an impress of Saturn as a whole. So like microcosm. But he says this is like, again, it's a semblance and it's more like a machine rather than like a kind of voluntary activity of like an eye that one possesses. But he says, and this is the first seed given of what is still only in the seedling stage, even in the human being of today, namely spirit man or Atma. So that's like that highest potential member of the human, or at least of us, even if we're not always human. And so that's interesting, like this sort of evolutionary endpoint, at least as I understand it, connected with what Steiner calls Vulcan, is seated at the very beginning with the physical. And so I'm gonna hurry towards the end. And so then he goes on prior to the warmth phase, there was this pre-phenomenal reality, inner warmth, spiritual light, which is darkness, and pure spiritual being, which I think of self-presence without outer stimulus, spirits of movement, wisdom, and will, respectively. And then again, just a refrain of that aphorism, interior is anterior. He says, thus, with the appearance of the Saturn warmth, our evolution first emerges from an inner life of pure spirituality to an existence manifesting outwardly. Then he says that with this development of Saturn, this is the advent of time, whereas everything prior, if you can say that, or anterior, I should say, was of the nature of duration, where there's not this linear temporal sequence. Maybe someone else can say more about that. And let's see if there's anything else to mention. He goes into, like the cosmic, after something, it's been built up and achieved, then there's like this, um, the spirits withdraw and like Saturn, he says the whole Saturn epoch planetary epoch, evolution dies away into itself with this withdrawal of the spiritual activity in the periphery. And it becomes like a seed in the soil to reemerge again once these beings, and they evolve through this, receiving the
Does it
reflection.
mean anything to you? Excited? Makes
And
her feel better?
yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Some questions. Just one thing to know, I think is beautiful is this depiction of evolution and creation as just this ongoing kind of like gift exchange. So something's being given back, and there's a kind of like the reflection as a kind of almost like uh, yeah, a giving forth of what was given. And then again, like if we're not always human, us, what are we? Like how do we designate what we are across different epochs if we're not always human? It's just an interesting question. But I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention. And yeah, Rosemary, go ahead. You're muted, Rosemary.
Thank you. That was a great recap. I appreciated the statement that you started with, that we have amnesia about these early parts of our existence, and Steiner provides us the means to regain memory of this. And maybe like you, I started reading Steiner before I met anybody who was with the, had this worldview. And when I went to a Steiner summer school about a year later, another person was talking about the first time they read this book and the strange awakenings and feelings, subtle inner things that you'd never felt before. And maybe some of you have been going through that this week if this is the first time you read it. And I'm wondering whether that is what Steiner means when he says spiritual research is the proof. in other words, we have all these new experiences. We can't pin them down or name them, but just the fact that we're going through something so new that we can't explain is, proof in embryo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably how he understood it. I was kind of reminded of Plato's concept of anamnesis. It's a soteriological process, though he didn't describe it this way. But I think they could be put in continuity with each other. Max?
Yeah, thank you, Ashton. Just on your last point, the question of if we weren't human, then what were we? Um, One method that I've developed if I encounter like a perplexity with Steiner is, and this he actually explicitly recommended we do this in the last course, the astronomy course, something about the way when we run into a dead end in our like research in the cosmos, we should look to the embryo. And when we run into a dead end in our research of the embryo, we should look to the cosmos. And sort of like a similar reciprocal connection that I employ is when we're talking about the development of humankind, to then return to the so when we're talking about the development of phylogeny, to return to ontogeny, and like ask the question. And I think this is right, that you could index the different periods of the gestation of an embryo to the various kingdoms of nature, and you can like conceive of how new dimensions to experience and life are being added at every stage. So that's just like a small comment that I wanted to make.
Thanks, Max. I will reflect on that. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. I went back to Dionysius the Areopagite's Celestial Hierarchies, or Celestial Hierarchy, is one of his books on angelology, just to see how these various beings are described there and how Steiner's drawing on them. And it's quite striking to see the way in which Steiner is attempting to turn what had been a static vertical hierarchy into an evolutionary process. And I think here also of Schelling, and connecting to what Max was just saying about ontogeny. Sometimes Schelling's philosophy is described as an attempt to transform ontology to refigure it as ontogeny, so to understand the whole history of the universe as a developing embryo. And I think Steiner is engaged in a similar project here. And just, to note the way in which, as you were describing, the work of the hierarchies in sort of ministering to this Saturn being and supporting the development of its life and its soul and its consciousness, even if initially a very dim sleep-like consciousness, that Saturn didn't yet possess any of these capacities, but that the hierarchies in this environing way were raying these capacities down to Saturn, and Saturn was acting as a mirror, reflecting it back to them. And so in some sense, it's both the hierarchies ministering to Saturn to help Saturn in its evolution, but also Steiner describes the various celestial beings gaining and evolving their own capacities as a result of the mirroring of Saturn. And so there's a two-way evolution going on here. It's not just, these higher angelic beings, bringing Saturn to life, but somehow Saturn, in mirroring them back to themselves, they're also becoming more evolved. And just another thing to note about the strange inversion here, this is an evolutionary process, but we're used to thinking of evolution in our materialistic age quite differently. So Steiner is basically saying that the senses like sense qualities of taste, say, precede the organs which we would assume are responsible for them. So taste actually leads to metabolism and digestion, and and so it's the reverse of the physical causal mechanistic understanding that we would have nowadays. Very important to note that. But I also think it's interesting, the last thing I'll share is that Steiner seems to be saying that Saturn had a physical nature, that it was not gas, it was not liquid or solid, but some, he says, yet finer substance than gas. And gas is just this warmth quality condensed, right? And so it's tempting here to start to try to imagine, well, nowadays, and I've talked about plasmas before, and I don't want to overly literalize what Steiner is saying, but what sort of a physicality might he be talking about, and is there any equivalent in contemporary physics? It's one question I would want to raise.
Thanks, Matt. Your initial comments were just reminding me of Jacob Sherman's thesis on Barfield and Teilhard. I think he's referring to Arthur Lovejoy, and he says something like the Romantics, like there's like this temporalization of the great chain of being that I think is, we're exploring in Steiner. And yeah, I can't, there was something else I was gonna say, but I can't remember what it was. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Thanks, Ashton. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to say something maybe outrageous that came to my mind when I was reading this. This is not the first time I read the book. I read it. This was the first book by Steiner I ever read. I read it some 20 years ago, and during this time, I have been reasoning by myself about the structure of both the universe and mostly the evolution of the universe. And even if I was influenced, of course, by Steiner, I hadn't been, reading with attention these parts of the evolution during the last years, so I didn't remember many details. Nonetheless, when I by myself tried to reconstruct how a system which is participatory, which is which sees a difference between states of consciousness, like wake, sleep, death, and dream, and sees a difference between man, animals, plants, and minerals. This to be evolutionary coherent, then there are certain steps that one has to make. And so I found many of the things that I've been writing about in this chapter, and as I said, I was influenced by it, but I think that the similarities go beyond that. It's just something that comes from a deductive point of view. So to finish this, what I mean is that, and the outrageous thing is that, however detailed and strange this narration we get, it's so particular that we get a strong feeling of seeing, and we get this theme of the super sensible organ. But are we sure that one has to really possess some higher faculty to arrive at these conclusions? Because to me, this may be a provocation, but think about it. Maybe let me know what you think. I think one could arrive at the same conclusions and the same descriptions that Steiner is making from an a priori point of view. And I think that both in Schelling and in Hegel, we find this kind of reasoning and structures. And yeah, the outrageous part, I think, is that, yeah, when we read this, it's so, at least when we read this the first time, maybe this looks like really a description of something that is being seen, and it could not be anything but something that has been seen, because it's, yeah, it's too detailed, too complex, too full of concrete aspects. But I think this a fallacy. I think one could arrive from this from a purely deductive point of view. And I'm curious what you think about this. Take it maybe as a provocation, I don't know, but I take it seriously. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorenzo. I mean, I that seems congruent with the way that Steiner talks about his method in the philosophy of freedom. So yeah, I like that provocation. And he was always like emphasizing that other people could do what he was doing. So that's an interesting way to frame it. And I think it puts him more in continuity with Neoplatonists, as you were describing Hegel and Schelling. Sam?
Yeah, thanks for that recap, Ashton. My thoughts are a little disorganized. They're kind of smattered all over the place, but yeah, this is my first time going through this book, and I'm having a similar experience of like when you're an undergrad and you get Freud for the first time, and you just get his conclusions, and he just seems like this kind of depraved, sick guy, and you're like, how did he come to these conclusions? And then you actually read Freud, and you follow his thinking. It's kind of similar with like getting the depth of these different epochs. But yeah, one of the things that's really sitting with me is this notion that I guess we're in the fourth iteration of the kind of gradual perfection of the physical body, and the way that Steiner talks about that and shows how elegant it is with the heart, or the way the femur kind of connects in the interstices of the joint. And then this notion that the etheric and the astral, but like particularly like the astral body, is really still kind of young, and that shows up in the kind of tempestuousness of the astral body. The what do I want to say? The kind of volatility of our emotions and all those things. And he may go into this later, but just sort of anticipating that these things will be kind of perfected in the future. It's making me think of the way that Aurobindo and the Mother, for instance, will kind of talk about the sadhana in the work, and the way that Steiner talks about this as well, like kind of getting beyond our cravings in a certain way, or we have to detach from those sort of things and not be in thrall to them. It seems like the ego is kind of participating in that process. I guess I'm just sort of curious to what I find myself speculating or wondering what role the ego actually has to play in terms of its participation in not succumbing to the tempestuous of the astral body, to actually play an active role in its gradual perfection in epochs to come, which is to say, like having keeping to the purpose of the ego, or the aim of the ego, and participation with the spiritual. How active is the ego now in the kind of refinement of the etheric and astral bodies in epochs to come? Maybe that will be answered to come, but that's just such a glaring question that I'm left with after reading this far.
Thanks, Sam. I'm sure many other people have things to say in connection with that, but the way I think about it is that the ego sort of allows, for us to have that distance between the passions and I guess that seat of agency in us, so as to like shape them. And yeah, maybe Matt has more to say about that or something else.
Well, just yeah, I did have something else I want to talk about. what Lorenzo mentioned about the potential a priori, almost transcendental deduction that Steiner could be engaged in here. But I'll get back to that. In terms of the role of the ego, I mean, Sam, you mentioned Freud initially, and I haven't read Freud as closely as you have, but and you know this, I'm sure. Steiner's conception of the I is quite different from Freud's, and it's not in Steiner. It's not just that the I functions to like repress our animal instincts or something, and there's also sort of a way in which the I is not just resisting cravings, but also directing our sympathies in a more loving direction. And so there are certain even sensual experiences that are actually furthering of our spiritual growth, and it's not just a matter of being more ascetic and that the I is trying to rein in all of the astral bodies once. It's more like, well, which desires are fruitful and which are not, and how can the astral body's tempestuousness be how can we calm the waters and allow for a more loving mode of engagement with the world is how I would see the ego's role there, and also to bring some degree of insight and knowledge, but I'll let others comment more on that. In terms of Steiner's method here, I think immediately, Lorenzo, of Schelling and Schelling's disagreement with Hegel, and Schelling's late positive philosophy, where Schelling will characterize his own earlier form of philosophizing and Hegel's form of philosophizing as negative philosophy, which would be more conceptual, asking what are the conditions of the possibility of knowledge and even of existence, and that ends up manifesting as a kind of dialectical logic, right? And ordinary intellect can do that. But Schelling in his late philosophy develops this alternative approach he calls positive philosophy, which instead of asking what are the conditions, the a priori conditions of possibility, positive philosophy is more concerned with existence as such, that anything exists at all, rather than what its essences might be. And from Schelling's point of view, we can't approach the sheer facticity of existence logically. We have to, he wants to develop what he calls a metaphysical empiricism, or sometimes he calls it a mystical empiricism, which would be, and that's where also Schelling develops his philosophy of mythology. And he'll describe how, rather than anthropologists who already in Schelling's day in the 1840s, when he was articulating this, anthropologists were beginning to say, oh, human beings made up myths for political purposes or whatever. And Schelling says, no, myth made human beings. Human consciousness is a product of a mythological process. And so, Schelling's anamnesis, as it were, to recover the origins of this sense of consciousness that's reflecting on itself and a merely apparent world that you kind of get in Kant. Schelling wants to recede behind that through a kind of anamnesis, going through the mythological process back to the origins of creation, and to participate in God's own creative act. And I think this is, for Schelling, it's an experiential thing. It's a kind of metaphysical empiricism. It's not a priori logic anymore. But that's not to say that you're not onto something there. I think there's a schematic way in which we can engage in that kind of transcendental logic to get like the basic structure of this, but to really feel the real existence of these beings that were involved in the process is a different sort of participation. It's not merely conceptual. And, Schelling would say these two approaches, the negative and the positive, the conceptual and the experiential, you could say, can work hand in hand with each other, and we need both, and we can kind of oscillate back and forth to check our work, as it were. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in the mix. I think it's really interesting, the point you're bringing up, and this whole debate that Schelling had. I mean, Schelling lived 20 years longer than Hegel, and so got to have the last word. but this whole distinction that Schelling makes between positive philosophy and negative philosophy, I think, is really important for the point you're trying to make. Hope that wasn't too much in the weeds, but
That was great. Thanks, Matt. Angus?
Hi all. Thanks for all your really rich contributions. Matt, that was really interesting what you're talking about there. Negative, positive, cataphatic, apophatic. It's like this tension between two extremes, and in philosophy of freedom it becomes perception and thinking as well. You've got this like tension between like the material and the spirit, the infinite and the finite. This and it's between these tensions that that we find ourselves. And if we're pulled too strongly in one direction, part of the solution is to like try and move in the opposite direction to broaden the scope. That wasn't what I actually planned to say. I just thought it was really interesting, some of the ideas you were kicking around there, Matt. I would like to share how I like process what is a really dense 20 pages of matter, not because my method is good, it's just my method. The reason for doing it is I'd like to encourage other people to share how do they like process. There's so many moving parts like in this little bit, and it's not going to get any easier when we come to moon, a sun, moon, and Earth. So when I was, it's like I make notes, like I guess you guys do as well. And I came up with sort of like some graphics, and then I decided, okay, I'll go the whole hog. So I created this with labels and things here, which sort of like gave me something to just dwell on, to live with this picture, with these labels. And what's interesting is how like new ideas or associative ideas like pop in there when you've actually got content to work with. It's almost like you've created a provisional picture for yourself, and that becomes like a sandpit for other ideas to play in there. So when Matt was talking about Dionysus the Areopagite, one of the strong thoughts that sort of like came as I was able to like felt that I had an overview of it as linking it also to I sensed aspects of Aristotle's 10 categories coming in there, which I also only sense, I don't know, I can't, but it's like the coming into existence of time and space and individualization, and then individualization with individual consciousness. All of these processes being like mapped into this process was something I found enriching. And so I'm interested to hear how when you guys are like trying to process this dense material, do you what type of tricks do you use to work with that type of thing? And there was another thought that I also would like to link to Lorenzo's point. This is another point that came up for me when I was like contemplating my picture. But if there were several bits of that passage that were reminding me of Plato's description of the world soul being sort of like put on the cross there without ever using that imagery. It's like when this individualization is going on, but you've got this whole life body which is gradually split up there. And so turning to more concretely to Lorenzo's point, whilst it does seem that like certain other thinkers like Plato, for that example, with the example I just gave, have somehow they've either experienced or deduced it. I am not aware, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I am not aware of anything that it's like in Eastern traditions, which I know a little bit, and the Kabbalah, which I know a tiny bit as well, and it's like these different systems. I'm not aware of anything that has this sort of like this comprehensiveness about it. And I'd gladly hear from somebody if they think they found something similar in other traditions. I'm quite well read in like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And again, some of the imagery is very similar, but this level of detail I don't find anywhere else. So you could argue, yeah, you could deduce this, but if my facts are correct in what I just said, yeah, but the big thing is nobody has until Steiner. So that's yeah. So I chucked out quite a bit there, but I'd yeah, love to hear people's further thoughts.
Thanks, Angus. Yeah, I would say, definitely this is distinct, and I've never encountered this in particular anywhere else. But still, I think we could see continuities with other traditions, and but yes, I agree. Yeah, I imagine. Lorenzo, did you want to say anything in response to that, or
Uh, well, I think what is really interesting is that when you have a complex system where the parts interact in more than one way, and the system evolves, and you add complexity to it, even if this is done schematically, the contents of what you are looking at when you interpret it and you make it concrete give you let's say plus value, give you something more than what you put in. You get an explosion of qualities that is really out of nothingness. And I don't think that the 2 points are really contradicting each other, because maybe that's the nature of super sensible organs itself. And I'm not saying that we should think of Steiner's power of seeing as just metaphorical here, but I think that the two things coincide. And regarding the fact that there are no systems as complex as this before, I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't read the whole of Plato, and when you go into Plato's dialogues, they are really complex. For example, I haven't reached the depths of Kabbalah, but I know that it can be really complex, because I think it gets to the same kind of complexity, because you get the tree of life, but you get also the 4 worlds, and you get also the 7 palaces, and there is also an evolution, before and an after of the tree of life. And if one would put all of that together, I think the complexity is the same. Also, I think the science of logic by Hegel is I don't know Schelling enough, but I think that the science of logic also has the same kind. I think they are like equations, and we get this. If we think just of the body, we get, okay, it's 4 bodies. But as soon as we think about the epochs and the metabolisms and the states of consciousness, this raises. And it's not just that we have a lot of single cases to examine and to speak about, but we also have a change of degree. So you get it's like when you solve a polynomial equation and you get that sequence. If it's a certain degree, you get like 1, 2, 1. But if it's a 3rd degree, then it gets like 4, 6, 6, 4, and these changes of degree of the results that you get, they are really qualitative changes. So I think that we can look at this from a mathematical point of view. And I'm sorry if in my first observation, maybe I didn't really touch the most interesting point, which is not opposing really, after all, the just schematic thinking to the visionary thinking, but the connection of the two. And this can be seen, I think, also in pure mathematics. As I said, when you think about numbers or unknowns that have a certain degree, then you know that the nature of that unknown depends on the degree. It's a totally different thing, changing. And when you get a geometrical intuition of the different levels of complexities in numbers, then you get also pictures, you get quality. And I think that's at the heart of vision, of suprasensible vision. And yeah, that's really the most interesting part. But my, let's say, antithesis was there to show how interesting is the fact that all this richness comes out of something that could be schematic. And I think that the schematic part is the most counterintuitive. So that's why I put it forward.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Jeff, would you like to bet? It doesn't look like you're unmuted, but oh wait, try it now.
Talking about technology
There you
and
go.
challenges. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. Like Sam, well, like me, as this conversation has gone on, I had a lot to say that was cohesive at the beginning, and it's being blown apart at every turn. You bring in Plato, and we have I think of the cave wall, right, as relates to this reciprocity of involuntary aspect of formation that's going on one side, and the voluntary one that's going on in creation, say, but that there's a reciprocal relationship. And in a way, you could say that Plato's cave wall isn't just the allegory that we think of it as, but was a witnessing of the way things actually come into being. I think that was one of the things I was thinking about as this conversation progressed. So I think because I have so many directions to go because of this great conversation, it's a good problem to have. I think I'll just take that bit about what the ego's role is. And I think Freud should have read Steiner. And I'm not joking about that. I think it was that psychology missed Steiner. This goes back to Riddles of Philosophy and my old harangue and lament about what happened to psychology without it being phenomenological. And you can't be phenomenological unless you're cosmological. So I would really be interested in that paper that you're going to write, Matt, that compares Steiner's cosmology to Whitehead's cosmology, right? Because this is a necessary thing, I think. And it speaks to what Lorenzo's saying. This just occurs to me, right? Is that it's like Whitehead urged forth something similar to what Steiner perceived. And then this goes to this notion of perception. What the hell is perception, right? Because he's talking about, and he uses a great turn of phrase, which is it's the atmosphere is not an it. And we're so used to, in our sense perception, tying it to things rather than to a presence or being or qualities or these inadequate words. So there's that. Then I just want to say this about ego, excuse me, and desire. So this is the role of the ego, at least as far as I can see, that's brought in the end of chapter 2, is it? When he talks about the generation of desire by the ego that's independent of the spiritual world and independent of the physical world, not connected to those phenomenological realities, but a self-generating desire that also works similarly to the way this cosmological process through beings works, which is using our physicality as a reflective device to see the way in which not only see, that's not right, to generate metamorphosis of sense organs into cognitive capacities as opposed to just perceptual capacities. Jesus, I think that's about the best I can do.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, lots of mystery there. Bruce, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for the conversation today. I don't share the philosophical background that many of you have, and so I don't have the same language that I can use. So I just have to use my own language, and I hope that you see that there's connections to what others have been saying. I do want, I decided to say something after Lorenzo's first comment, which I'm not going to try to summarize, so I wouldn't get it right. But let me just put it this way. If I try to look outside myself for something that is, Steiner calls Saturn or sun or moon, and try to have an experience of those external things, I fail over and over again. I can have I can make artistic drawings. I think I've got one of sun that I made years ago, to try to bring these things to more real to me. If those attempts had any fruit, they didn't come to consciousness. If I do something different, if I look inside myself, and it's hard to explain what that means, inside myself, because as soon as I look inside myself, I'm confronted with this. And what this is, what all of this is, which is a continual problem for me. And so struggling through that, what this is out here, what these sense percepts are, I come to something that is more like an inner experience that is closer to what that allows me to come closer to an inner experience of what Steiner means when he uses words in this chapter. I would say it's not a complete failure, which is a pretty big thing since this is my third time through these things over many, many years. I think this is something along the lines that Lorenzo is saying in a very different way, and that other people have touched on in other ways.
Thank you, Bruce. I think we'll close out with Karsten. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say briefly that, I mean, as a comment to what a lot of people have said, that my experience being the first time around reading this stuff was that something was going on in my mind that was similar to what Steiner was describing. So there is some kind of creative process taking place in my mind that kind of mirrors the ontogeny that he's describing. And I experienced some of the same things when we read the astronomy course. I just think it's interesting that Steiner has this ability to introduce things where this kind of mirroring effect arises, that something is going on in your mind that is actually quite similar to what he's describing as something that has happened in space or in time.
Thanks, Karsten. Yeah, it reminds me of what Matt was saying earlier about positive philosophy, and that there's something about the way Steiner, his method and the way he writes, that is like transmitting, it's like metamorphic, and it's like yeah, I guess like yeah, is like a kind of, it feels different than reading other things, especially before bed. It feels almost like it's not good. Yeah. Anyway, I can relate to that. Well, we're at time. Thanks everybody for your participation for another rich discussion. See you all next week. If anybody wants to summarize any future reading selections, just let us know. And yeah, thanks again.
Did you see Bruce's comment there,
Oh.
Ashton?
Oh, Bruce, I will email them to
I have to
you.
go. Bye.
Bye. They're on the Substack, but I'll email them to you. Yeah. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Great weekend.
Bye-bye.